I'm Andrew McMillen. I'm a freelance journalist. I write for Rolling Stone, The Australian, Penthouse, others. I haven't prepared anything in my story if you want to know how I did this, ask me afterwards. Instead, I've prepared a dozen points to keep in mind. Freelancing at its heart is really just hustling. It's learning how to support yourself through persistence, energy, and ingenuity. That's all. Learn how to hustle when you're set. The only problem is that it takes years to learn how to hustle consistently. When you start freelancing, the learning curve is steep. You're fighting against the world, fighting to be heard, fighting to get your name recognized, fighting to get paid. You probably won't make enough money in the first year to pay your rent, which is why you should do other work on the side until you can afford to freelance full time. But eventually, perhaps years later, it becomes less of a fight. You learn to glide through the world rather than struggling against it. You see things differently with wiser eyes. You can dip in and out of conversations, projects, and work relationships with much less friction because there's much less to lose. You have less to prove because you've already proven yourself to a certain extent. There's a lot to be said for starting slow though and at the bottom. For example, I wrote for Street Press essentially without being paid for nearly 2 years before I decided that writing and journalism was what I wanted to do. From there, it was a slow process of me working out how to get paid for what I wanted to do. Find your gap in the market, but be patient. After doing freelance journalism for a few years, I eventually realized that my gap is to read between the lines and write about what others aren't. That's when I'm happiest. That's not to say that all of my writing consists of that kind of work. I'd say that less than half of my income comes from writing those kinds of investigative feature stories. It's worth pointing out that I only had that realization in the last 12 months too, but that's when I'm happiest. I definitely didn't know my gap in the market when I started freelancing. In fact, I had very little idea of what I was doing when I started freelancing. I just did it. I started knocking on doors, some open, some remained shut. When I started freelancing, music journalism was the only kind that I did. Gradually, other interests took hold, and now music is one of many topics that I write about. I'd likely never have found these other interests, or that I was able to write about them though, unless I started with music. So don't be afraid to specialize early. You never know where your career will lead if you just keep at it. Hunger can't be learned, only encouraged. You and you alone must be hungry enough to want to succeed. This is an inbuilt character trait, I believe. You can't be taught to be hungry. You've got to be serious and dedicate yourself to your work if you want to succeed at freelancing. Your professional reputation is everything. Guard it with your life. Act with integrity at all times. Don't do things in private that you wouldn't be comfortable with if they became public. Make a list of the best practitioners in your field, your favorites. Consume their work over and over. Work out why you like them and what they do that appeals to you. Then think about how you can put an original spin on their approach or their approaches. It'll take you a while to find your style and your voice in any creative medium. Photography, illustration, comedy, writing. Don't rush it. I'm not sure if it even can be rushed. Anyway, it's a process that can't be shortcut. Surround yourself with allies. Not necessarily other freelancers, not necessarily people working in the same field as you, but you should start building up a support network and regularly keep in touch with as many of those people as you can, because some of your best work will arise from one-off meetings and incidental friendships. Allies are important because freelancing is generally a solitary activity. Everyone needs to communicate with others at some stage. Best to start early. Be wary of anyone who glamorizes the so-called freelance lifestyle. Most of freelancing is incredibly mundane, seriously. Most of my days are spent alone on the computer. Some weeks I don't even leave the house during my work days, but there are definitely occasional glimmers of awesomeness that remind you why you're doing this and why you love it. Don't get me wrong, freelancing is great, but to a certain extent it's a job like any other. There'll be days when you don't want to do any work at all. However, if you can push yourself even to work on those shitty days, you'll eventually be a great freelancer. And finally, don't talk so much online. Just do good work, make meaningful connections, and be pleasant to everyone you meet behind the scenes. Try not to buy too much into meaningless talk fests on Twitter and Facebook. Ultimately, you are the only person standing between success and failure. While you're tweeting away your work days, your freelance competition is quietly beating you. Don't give them the chance.